I'll be demonstrating how to weave in the ends of your yarn in your knitting. So whether you have just or you have started a new ball of yarn, or at the end of your project you're left with the tail that needs to be woven into your knitting. The best thing to do is to weave it in the most invisible fashion possible, and just do it on the wrong side of your work to hide the weaving. So I'm going to turn my little piece of stockinette here to the wrong side of my work, and here I have the purl side. I have some nice great big stitches here that will make it easier for you to see how to weave in invisibly. Of course, if you were weaving in your ends, you would be weaving in with your tail, which would be the same color of yarn, which would make it more invisible. But just for demonstration, I'm going to use a contrasting red thread so you can follow along. Now, be it midstream of your project or at the end, you would thread your tail onto a tapestry needle and then follow along a piece of yarn. Just choose the thread closest to your tail, and you are going to follow that piece of yarn as how it travels through your knitting. So we'll follow this piece of yarn, and we're going to basically lay our tail on top of the yarn to hide it on the back side. So this piece of yarn travels under this loop, and then you can see it follows along this way under that loop. I'm going to go ahead and draw that tail through. Mine, of course, has an end, but that's because it's not the real tail. So here the yarn then comes out from that loop and around this way. So I will follow with my thread under here, and then you can see that the thread or yarn then comes back into the same loop that we started with. Draw my tail through there. So I'm just laying my tail on top of the yarn and following along the path that our yarn takes when it knits. So under this loop, and then here it is, you can see the needle going right on top of the stitch or the piece of yarn that we're trying to follow. And we just get this nice little rhythm going. So now here my yarn that I'm following comes out from here, over on top of there. So follow it here, underneath that loop, and then it comes under this loop. And it comes out from under here, under that loop, this way, under here. You can get a little quicker if you just do under two loops at a time. And it takes a little bit of practice until you can get used to it. But you'll be able to see the path that the yarn takes and just follow it along. Coming out from here, under this loop, under that loop. You don't want to pull this too tight. You want it to mimic the tension of your knitting. So coming out from here, here comes my yarn under this loop and back again through that loop. And I usually like to weave about 6 inches worth of my tail through my knitting. The good news about weaving in your ends as opposed to making a knot is that should your weaving come undone, you just weave it right back in, which almost never happens. Where if a knot comes undone, then you're just left with this tiny little piece of thread and nothing to do with it. So I'm going to make this my last stitch. It comes, my yarn that I'm following comes under here, back under that loop. So I've woven in about 6 inches of thread, and of course this is not as pretty as normal tension would be, but I go ahead and I give it a little stretch just to make sure none of my ends are going to come out. And I can go ahead and cut my ends. And if this were the same color of thread, you would not see anything here. And even with a contrasting thread on the front side of my work, it is nearly invisible. It doesn't disturb the design or change the tension at all. Happy knitting!